All right. I was about to get worried thinking the projector wasn't going to work, but we got it going. All right, for all you biology majors and doctors in the room, I need your help this morning. You know a lot more of this than I do, so bear with me. If I say something wrong, just pop up and say, no, it's this. You got that wrong. So today we're going to look at the second part of evolution. Last week we kind of talked about what the theory was, how it came about, Charles Darwin, origin of the species, all that sort of thing. So here is the quick rundown of everything we're going to go through this morning. We're going to do a review, look at vestigial organs, embryology, homology, fossil records, mutation, peppered moths again, bats, Archaeopteryx, extinction, Tiktaalik, Coelacanths, bone beds, fossilized mammals, and Occam's razor to end it. So we're going to move pretty quickly this morning. And there's one thing I want to make a statement this morning, just kind of set where we are. Throughout this series, we've talked about faith versus science as like they're opposing ideologies or something. And I want to make it clear, like I'm a scientist. I look at things from a scientific perspective, and in my mind, I try to view any situation as scientifically as possible. I think that we ought to look at the Bible scientifically. You know, the word science comes from the Greek word skyer, which means to know. That's the main thing I took from my dad's 7th grade science class a long time ago. And, you know, we don't really know a whole lot. That's why the first lesson we had in here was discussing the difference in observation and inference. We can observe things and know that they're true, and then we can infer things from that that are our best guesses. You know, I don't know very much. I base a lot of things, almost everything, on inference. That's all I have. I can see things, I can use my senses, and I have to trust them. They can still be wrong. We have hallucinations. We have things that, you know, you hear a creak in the night and you assume someone's breaking in your house and it's nothing. You know, we have all these things where we take a little bit of information to make inferences, and that's how we work as a human species. And that's how I view the Bible. The reason I'm a Christian is because looking at all this stuff supports my ideas scientifically. It's not that I have some view opposed to science. I think we all need to be scientific in our thinking. I think we all need to kind of take a Ronald Reagan quote here, trust but verify. You know, you can trust someone on something, but you know what, go check it out for yourself. And that's what we're talking about here. The things that we are discussing here today are things that you may not have been exposed to. Everyone's got different lives. Everyone has different things that they have time to look at, study, review. You know, we're all busy. But this is a chance for us, hopefully, where I can present some information that will get you thinking and give you a little bit of a base to understand these biblical principles in regard to science, that they're not diametrically opposed, they're not opposites. And so that's what we want to look at today, is look at evolution and how, you know, there are some things about it that we have to accept, there's some things about it we can blatantly tell are wrong, and we're going to look at some of those today. So, to review, this theory came about in about the 1860s. Charles Darwin was the first man to kind of come up with this idea. He drew a tree of life, as he called it, where maybe there was something that over time different changes have occurred and branched out, and we have different species that came from one living organism. You know, we can tell that microevolution is a fact. We can observe that in dogs, we can observe that in people. You know, if you were to go back, if you had a time machine and can go back 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, you know, most of us would be the tallest person in the room. We as a species have changed. But that doesn't mean we're a different species. We're still human. If you look at dogs and go back 1,000 years, they look quite different. You know, like I had the slide of my dog last week. Sadie wouldn't have been around 3,000 years ago. They didn't look like that. Changes have occurred. But what we also see is that macroevolution, or the idea that one species becomes a different species, is something we don't really have any proof of. You know, it's a logical leap that a lot of people make based on microevolution. We can also see that survival of the fittest, which was a quote that Herbert Spencer came up with based on the origin of the species, is also true. If all the trees have leaves way high up, the short giraffe doesn't get to survive. All the tall ones do. And if their genes show that they demonstrate a taller height, well, they're going to survive. And the ones with shorter genes aren't. We can see those, but that doesn't suddenly mean that giraffes split into two different kinds of giraffes. So, This quote in my studies over the past week was popped up a couple times. So Cobb County Board of Education in Georgia. This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. That's all I'm asking you to do. This is doing it from the perspective, hey, this stuff's probably right, go along with it. I'm asking you to do it, listen to it, have an open mind about it, understand what they say. Don't have this blocked off mind of, no, it's wrong before even we get looking at it. Listen to it. You know, I'm hopefully going to show you some areas where it's probably not the best idea, but let's look at it from a critical standpoint. So, like I said, all you biology people, help me out. But vestigial organs are organs that seemingly do not have a purpose. And the one that we always heard about in school growing up is, oh, you don't need your appendix. It's just there to give you appendicitis and kill you. Well, evolution claims that these are leftover traits from what used to be helpful or beneficial things. We should see these things becoming more useful if evolution is true. You should see adaptations or benefits moving towards something else, but we don't see that. This is the opposite. They're saying it's remnants of things. And the example that an evolutionist used last night that I was looking at, he said that a great example is the fact that I can wiggle my ears. I don't know if any of y'all can do that, but I can wiggle my ears. It does nothing for me, but he says it's a leftover trait that cats, dogs, and other animals that have to move their ears in different positions to hear things, that it's a leftover trait from that. You know, take that for what you will, but that doesn't prove to me that, well, I came from a cat because I can move my ears around. I don't think so. Many have suggested examples of vestigial organs have been proven to have uses. So over time, many things that were seemingly thought to be vestigial organs aren't. They have uses that are maybe not so apparent. It's obvious why we have hands. It's not so obvious why we have an appendix or tonsils or other things that, you know, we can live without. But these things have also been shown to have benefits over time. So, going back to our two key terms that we had from the beginning of this study, observation and inference. You know, observations are made about these organs and their usefulness. Now, observations are not always conclusive. There are some times that we don't have enough information that we can gain later on from studying something. And that's what's happened in these situations, is that observations were made, they couldn't conclude anything, any use for them. They inferred they were useless and must be left over from past useful traits. And later on we find, no, they still have benefits for us or for other animals or other organisms. Any thoughts or anything? This is going to be kind of rapid fire, so just speak up real quick as we move through these because we've got a lot of them. All right. The next one, embryology. So an embryo is what we all were at one point before we were birthed. It is development from conception to birth. And Ernst Haeckel in the 1860s Germany read The Origin of the Species and thought, man, I want to help this idea out. I think it's got some credibility. Let's see what we can figure out to help support this. So the first thing he did is he decided he wanted to create something in support of an idea. That's not really objective science. You know, that's loaded already. He's trying to prove a point and trying to support an idea. So on this side, I'm not sure if this was his original drawings that he made or if this is a reproduction or something, but the idea that he supported was this phrase that sounds real smart. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And he would repeat that over and over, and these graduate students and people, yeah. So the idea is that embryos replay the evolutionary history in their development. They start out as a simple-looking little amoeba, fish-like thing here, and as they grow, changes occur, and so you have a bird that looks different than a pig, that looks different than a lamb. But the idea was that they all kind of look the same when you begin, and that over time, they have different changes that occur. And this example is still used in textbooks. I remember seeing this in textbooks when I was a kid. is that, and I've seen it even in college, this was something that was brought up at times, is the idea that, well, we all look the same and we all develop in the womb the same. Now, the problem is, this is kind of cherry-picked. He took things that kind of matched, and it's not even true to the point that some people said, those are not even what the embryo of the animals you say they are look like. He had actually just used the same drawing a few times for a few of them and guessed on a few others, that it wasn't real science. He was trying to build an argument to support a conclusion that he already had. And so this was actually proven to be a hoax in 1874, so just 10 to 15 years after it was introduced. And yet textbooks still use this over 100 years later. At that point, we have to come to a conclusion. Are science textbooks lazy? Are the textbook companies lazy, or are they trying to support an idea? And if you're trying to support an idea, it's not science anymore, that's a religion. And that's what, through this study, it's not that I'm opposed to science, we are opposed to science as a religious community. As Christians, we are seeking truth. That's what we're seeking. And in any way we can get it, we need to be looking for the truth. Sometimes it may not agree with what we believe, and that's okay. We have to accept truth and get rid of what we find to be false. I hate being wrong. But when I am, I have to suck it up and accept it. And the scientific community seems that in some areas, they're trying to hang on to things that even though they have proven to be false, it supports their overall idea and they'll still use it. And we don't need to be guilty of that as Christians, to hang on to false ideas just because they support what we want to believe. Any thoughts on this?
Drew?
Yes.
In regard to the appendix, one thing about all this about science, you're taught something at a point in time, and everybody in the scientific community may accept that inference from a prior observation and teach it as fact.
Right.
And this is theory, we feel it's true based on all of this, but it's still, like you said, an inference. And so they teach it as fact. And then down the road, through further research and looking at things, all of a sudden now in retrospect, they look back and say, well, that's really not true. That happens all the time.
Yes, and that's the way it should be. It should be a constant reevaluation of information, and it should be updating constantly. Science should not be static.
Yeah, and whereas the Bible, that's the beauty of the Bible. You think how long ago it was written, and why in Genesis does it say, why did the Holy Spirit inspire Moses to pen the words, after their kind, each after their kind? Like you said, it's not from one species to
No.
But then, like the appendix. So this is from Oklahoma State University, Scientific American. For years, the appendix was credited with very little physiologic function. We now know, however, that the appendix serves an important role in the fetus and in young adults. Endocrine cells appear in the appendix of the human fetus at around the 11th week. These endocrine cells of the fetal appendix have been shown to produce biogenic amines, peptide hormones, compounds that assist with various biological control homeostatic mechanisms. There has been little prior evidence of this and any other role of appendix in animal research because the appendix does not exist in domesticated mammals. Adult humans, the appendix is now thought to be involved primarily in immune functions that peaks in the second and third decade of life. By the time you get old like me, after age 60, the appendix doesn't have much of a function. But it just goes to show you that, I was taught years ago, as is vestigial organ probably not needed, but now it's involved in lymphoid, immune system, and maturation of B lymphocytes.
Well, and that's one of the things you just said. It's not found in domesticated animals. So the idea is that it's something that, we have trained out of cats, dogs, and domesticated animals, that it's not useful if we've trained it out of these things. But now we find that there is uses, at least in the human body, for this organ, so it's not really even vestigial. The next thing is homology. And this is another thing that was kind of cherry-picked. So the idea is that if you look at different animals, the bone structures or different structures, and this is just an example, organs or whatever it is, have similar structures across different species. So if a whale, a bird, a dog, and a human all have a humerus, a radius, an ulna, and then your carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, well, you know what? If they all have the same thing and they're shaped differently, they probably came from the same place. And this sounds pretty compelling. Hey, it's, all these things look the same. They must have kind of deviated and changed over time, but we don't have any transitional fossils. We don't have, and we'll get to that in a little bit, we don't have any examples of where one thing split into two. We just have, it's kind of like a tree branch, but all we have is the end of the tree branch. You know, we can't see where the splits were. And this is something that was also used in a lot of textbooks that I saw throughout my life. Well, you know, evolution's true because we see that all these 4 different mammals have the same bone structure in their arm or in their front leg. And, you know, what we can observe is, yeah, they have, you know, similar construction, but we don't see where that actually means they came from the same place. Yes?
They came from the same designer.
They did come from the same designer. That's exactly right. And the way I look at it, you know, I can take a bunch of Lego pieces and arrange them however I want. They're still made of the same Lego pieces, but I can make what I want out of it. You know, that doesn't imply that, I mean, if I make stuff out of Legos, I made it. Just like Mike said, there's a designer there. That doesn't prove that they grew out of some random chance. So, this is probably one of the most compelling things to why evolution has stuck around and kind of fit the way it has. And this is the fossil record. And it's really hard to read because there's a lot of words and they're kind of small up here. But the idea is, and this is, I mean, basically true, the deeper you dig down, the longer ago it is. You know, if you find, let's say there was a battlefield and you have Civil War, Revolutionary War happening, fought on the same battlefield, you would expect to find Revolutionary War artifacts a little bit lower than the Civil War. It happened first, and things get buried over time. And so the idea is that over the Earth's time span, things that are further down happened earlier. And they find that this matches pretty well with their idea of the first living things, and as time goes, we get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the problem with this is we still don't see those transition fossils. We don't see the branches. We don't see where you have a bud shooting off of this tree branch. What we have is a tree branch and a tree branch and another tree branch, but nothing that shows, hey, yeah, this split into 2 different things. And this was one of Darwin's big questions he had, and that's why he proposed it as a theory. He didn't say, hey, this is fact. He said, you know, I got questions about this idea too. I think it's a good idea, but we don't see anything that actually changes into 2 different things. And as you can see in this picture maybe, up here you have some more recent animals, and as you get longer and longer, right here is between the Paleocene and the Cretaceous period, you start seeing the dinosaurs in the Mesozoic period. And then you get even lower and you see more aquatic life, and then down here you see very primitive shellfish and things like that. And this fits the idea of evolution that, you know, you started out with these sea-dwelling creatures and this primordial soup that over time became fish and became amphibians and then crawled up on land and then lived on land, and then we had birds. And it's just it's an idea that's built upon a lot of inferences. We can look at these things and we guess that this is what happened. They don't have observation of this. How can you observe something before now? You can't make an observation of the past. You can infer things happen. It's what crime scene investigation is. You don't show up at a crime scene and say, yep, I can tell this is what happened. You know, if you go to a crime scene and if you were blindfolded and led to a crime scene and you're looking around at what happened, you might could come up with a good idea until someone tells you this is a movie set. You know, that's a created scenario to look like something that's true. You know, it's very similar to this. We can observe things that are in this fossil record, but we don't know how they got to the depths they are, and we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. So the idea of this fossil record is what is these different levels, and they're not this defined. You don't dig down and have different colored dirt necessarily. We do have strata. You can see actual differentiated lines. The rocks are different colors. The rocks have different textures, composed of different materials based on different things that have happened in the past. But these are not so clearly defined that you have T-Rex and Triceratops here and other smaller dinosaurs right below it. And that's something we're going to show in a few slides. But as I just said, you know, there are observations and there are inferences. We observe that, yeah, these things tend to fall on the same strata or the same level depth across the Earth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, yeah, it took millions of years to do it. That's an inference that's based on those observations. Yes?
What's the scientific explanation for that you would typically hear? The reason that some of those things from way back, we developed from it, they're kind of origin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything's progressed. Why do we still see some of the things that were supposedly some of the origin, some of those fish and things that are still in existence? Why haven't they totally evolved out? Why do they still exist? Everything came from it and something else. What's the explanation?
Right. So the idea is like if we're here at the end of this branch and you're looking at the actual tree trunk of something that existed millions and millions of years ago, well, crocodiles have been around, according to this concept, crocodiles have been around since the time of the dinosaurs. So why do we still have crocodiles? Why do we still have other animals? And one interesting thing that's on the screen there, plants are virtually unchanged throughout. Why don't we see changes to plants? Why don't we see plants evolving at the same rate that we see animals evolving at? And I don't really know an answer. And I don't know that scientists necessarily have an answer. I guess their explanation would be that you have these genes that are virtually unchanged. You have some that deviate off. But once it hits a point of fitness, where it is apt to survive in its environment, it can stay in a kind of unchanged state. I guess that would be their argument. But I do find it strange that plants go unchanged virtually throughout this whole process, and yet we're talking about how we have this rapid change over time for animals. So the next thing they want to bring up is that mutations are how these changes occur. So a mutation is when the DNA of a cell gets changed in some way, whether it's radiation, whether it's just miscopied from RNA, something along those lines, you have these changes. Well, the problem is I can't think of any real examples where a mutation has been beneficial outside of comic books. You know, Spider-Man gets bit by a radioactive spider and he gets superpowers. Most people, when you are introduced to extreme radiation, you develop cancer and die. So the idea that these mutations would suddenly be beneficial is kind of unlikely. And maybe some of the doctors in here have some more ideas on that, but as far as from what I can tell, mutations very, very rarely seem to be beneficial. The idea that, you know, our entire evolution will be based on mutations is very unlikely, since the vast majority do harm to an organism instead of benefit it. And so DNA is actually in the center of all your cells. And this is kind of an idea of what it looks like. It's a double helix. The idea was founded by Watson and Crick in, I think, the 1950s. And this is how we're coded, just like computer code. Computer code's zeros and ones, it's binary. We actually have 4 different structures that create our DNA that gives us way more complexity than even a computer code. And this is copied in every single one of our billions and billions of cells. And it's copied very accurately, and if it's miscopied, usually that cell dies and actually ends itself. When it doesn't, that's what cancer is, the uncontrolled multiplication of a cell that has miscopied DNA. Or at least that's my high school education of it tells me. And so the idea that this is copied over and over and over and over, and that a mistake actually benefits the organism, is just very unlikely. And that's how we base this entire concept. So one of the best examples of mutation is in fruit flies. So the reason scientists have been using fruit flies is you can get a new generation every 14 days. And the idea is if we run tests and mutate fruit flies and, you know, selectively breed them and run radiation experiments and chemical experiments on them, we can see changes over time, very quickly. So the idea is over about the 100 years we've been experimenting with fruit flies, we have the equivalent of about 1 million years of evolutionary change. And fruit flies look the same as they did 100 years ago. Now, in defense of the scientific community, you're right, we're not rounding up every fruit fly in existence and mutating them to see what happens. But what we do see is that you run experiments on them, you make changes, you can change the color, you can change the size, you can change all these things about them, but a fruit fly is still a fruit fly. You haven't suddenly made something different. And usually the ones that have mutations, the ones that have been changed in some way are not reproductive, so you can't carry those traits on. And I won't break out Punnett squares and all that and bore you to death. So we'll move on to the next one. And this is an example that I used last week. It's the peppered moth, and this was supposed to be the definitive example of evolution. We see this change. Now, a bit of information I got this week in my studies is that the idea that peppered moths change their color because of landing on tree bark is not exactly the best information, because most peppered moths did not actually live on tree bark. They would be found in other areas besides on the tree. And so the idea that the soot and the die-off of the lichen that it matches in England in the 1800s shows that, you know, it wasn't necessarily that changed the color of peppered moths from this gray color to black. And the thing is for evolutionists to support this as one of their great claims, you didn't change the genetic DNA of a peppered moth. A peppered moth was still the same. Now, did this show survival of the fittest? Absolutely. You know, if you don't take a grizzly bear into the Arctic and expect it to survive as well as a polar bear, it's not built for that environment. And you don't expect to throw a brown rabbit out in the snow and expect it to stay alive as long as a white rabbit if there's wolves chasing it. Things that are adapted to their environment can survive better. And this is one of the trademarks of evolution, is they think that, you know, things that live in certain areas adapted to that environment. Well, I can just as easily say the opposite. By survival of the fittest, which they also claim to be true, anything that doesn't match that environment died off pretty quickly and was left with whatever was already there. That doesn't mean that it adapted to its environment over time. It just means that everything else died off. So bats. Bats are the only flying mammal. If there's only one flying mammal, and they evolved from other mammals like mice and stuff, why don't we see mice with little bitty fake wings on their back? Why don't we see the transition at some point of a mouse with a membrane stretched to the back of its arms that would simulate the beginning of a wing? How did a wing develop on a bat without having anything heading towards that? And these are the transition fossils that are missing from the fossil record. We have over 1,000 specimens of fossilized bats. We have 0 transition fossils from a mammal to a bat. You would expect to see some form of proto-bat or pre-bat, and we don't see that. And so the idea that bats have evolved from something else is unlikely when all you have is the end product. You know, suddenly one mouse popped out and had fully formed wings and was able to fly. Well, that's not what evolution says. They say it's incremental changes over time. But we don't see any fossils that support that incremental change. All we see is the end game of a fully formed bat. And it's the same for pterosaurs, a flying dinosaur. There are no dinosaur fossils that have baby little wings that would have that transition. We go from non-flying to flying, and there's nothing in between. And so here's a bat fossil, and this is what it, you know, looks like from thousands or millions of years ago. Another one's Archaeopteryx. This was an idea that this was the definitive transition fossil. This is the transition from dinosaur to bird. Problem is, it was never a dinosaur, it's always been a bird. It was a big, strange shaped bird, and we don't have them now, they're extinct, but it was not a transition. And the idea that it was a transition fossil is also kind of ruined when you find crow fossils lower down in the fossil record. So how can you have a transition fossil if birds already existed before this guy? It just doesn't match. So extinction. Another example is they say, well, things have died off, things don't exist anymore, things that were useless have passed and they're extinct. Well, extinction doesn't prove evolution. All it shows is survival of the fittest. Things that aren't fit to survive in an environment don't last. They're no longer on Earth. That doesn't mean that something new has changed or it's become something different. It just shows that things die off. So Tiktaalik. This was another example of a transition fossil. So this thing was supposed to be the creature that climbed up out of the ocean and onto land, and we transitioned from only an aquatic organisms to land-dwelling organisms. The problem is we've now found tracks that supposedly are 10 million years before Tiktaalik crawled up on land. So if he's the first thing to crawl on land, how do we have footprints 10 million years earlier? And that's what it supposedly looked like. And coelacanths. So coelacanths were another example of this transition fossil that was supposed to, its fins kind of look like legs. And so the idea was, yeah, this is where, this fish had fins that started becoming more like legs, and it's a transition. And yeah, but it's been extinct a long time until the 1900s, where we actually found some, and they're still living in the ocean, and you can actually go swim with them on the Comoros Islands. So it's not some extinct transition fossil from millions of years ago. They're still alive today in this exact form. So if they're an evolutionary progression and they're a transition fossil, why are they still here millions of years later? So bone beds. This is where we find huge dumps of dinosaur bones all in one place. And the idea is you see bigger bones on the bottom and smaller ones spread up to the top. And, one of the scientists that I was listening to said that this is exactly what you would expect in a mass extinction, where everything kind of in a aquatic or a mudslide or something, everything slid into one place, it gets mashed up, the bigger bones settle to the bottom, the small stuff's on top of it. And this was just another example of, this is, kind of shows where evolution doesn't fit this pattern, is when you look in these bone beds. And this is what they look like, just a bunch of fossilized bones laying on top of each other. And here's one of the most interesting things to me, is to talk about these geologic time periods where an organism fits into time and it came into existence and it left. The problem is, when you start looking at these layers, the fossils are unchanged. You don't see, well, we're beginning to look like a T-Rex and then it goes out of existence. No, we start with T-Rex, it exists for a period of time in this fossil record, and then it disappears. It's in this depth, but it disappears. And that's another way to look at it. Instead of calling it a time period, it's in a depth. It's buried a certain depth below the top layers of Earth. And then to talk about how mammals came along way after dinosaurs. Well, it's strange that we now have fossil records where you have mammals with dinosaur embryos and dinosaur fossils inside their stomachs. It's hard to eat something that died millions of years before you existed. And there's an example of what some people who are much more versed in this than I am say was a dinosaur fossil in the stomach of a mammal. And so this comes to the conclusion that I kind of want to get to, which is William of Ockham had this principle. And it said, all things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best. You can come up with a lot of inferences and a lot of examples to explain something. But generally, the most straightforward, simple thing is the best. And that's kind of how I view all this. Going back to the calf path example that I gave weeks ago about how we start with one wayward little calf hundreds of years ago, you end up with a metropolis city that winds and turns, and that's kind of what science has done. We follow this path and we listen to people who we believe are authorities above us, and we follow what they say, and we end up with a conclusion based on a lot of inferences. And that's kind of what's happened. Because going back to this quote right here, this textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact. Regarding the origin of living things, this material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. This was actually ruled to be unconstitutional. And it was ruled to be unconstitutional because it exuded too much religious idea. Where do you see any mention of religion in that? There is no religion in it. It's asking you to be a scientist. The problem is, we've got this backwards. We're the scientists here. When we look and evaluate information, when we take the things that we can verify to be true and reject the things based on the faith of some authority, that's being a scientist. Being an evolutionist is a religion. You are taking the word of someone else and you're looking at this path that they have followed and you're using faith just as we do. And the idea that it's some ironclad idea that is proven and proven and proven, it's just not true. No one has enough time to examine all the fossil record, to examine all the dig sites, to evaluate all the theories and all the ideas, and the wisdom to use all that appropriately. No one has that. We all use inference. We all use faith. And the fact that our society has fallen into this idea that religion is just a superstitious hoax that's for the weak-minded, and that science is the true authority in this world, is very far from the truth on this topic. Science does great things for us, but when it comes to the idea of where we've come from, it has very weak ideas. Thank you.